The Ford Capri was launched in 1969 as the car you always promised yourself. I mean, in the space of only a few years, cemented itself as the European Mustang. A phenomenally popular, affordable coupe with an image way in excess of its humble origins. But as the 1970s progressed, the Capri grew softer and the hot hatch relegated it to second place. But in 1981, the Capri was handed a final hurrah, a new halo model offering performance no hot hatch could. So today on TwinCam, this is the Ford Capri 2.8 injection. Before we begin, TwinCam is proudly supported by Bidding Classics, the new online marketplace for cool and interesting old cars, much like this V6 rear drive Ford. So if you fancy getting yourself a toy for summer, then please do follow the link in the description. As I've just mentioned, the Ford Capri was the European Mustang. It was developed in direct response to the American arm of the company's success and followed the same basic recipe. Take the engines and suspension from a car you already make and clothe them in an insanely cool two-door coupe body. In nearly 5 years, Ford had sold 1.2 million Capris across Europe, and was another example of Ford absolutely nailing the marketing of a new car, following 2 generations of Cortina and the iconic original Escort. While the idea of an affordable coupe was nothing new, look at the MGB and Reliant Scimitar for starters. The Capri was so well loved that it encouraged a raft of other manufacturers to follow suit, with cars like the Vauxhall Forenza, Opel Manta, Renault 17, Volkswagen Scirocco and even the Porsche 924 all following that simple recipe. But the key to the Capri's success was that it appealed to everyone. Despite being a coupe, it was roomier than an Escort, and Ford offered an engine to suit any budget. Having a halo effect was the big 3.1 litre fuel-injected Essex V6 in the RS 3100. But for a more family-friendly approach, you could instead get a simple 1300 Kent, just like the one you'd find in an Escort or a basic Cortina. Then, only to exaggerate the image, the Capri was Ford's preferred racing car in the early 70s, becoming one of the icons of touring car series across the continent. The Ford Capri was cool because it was used as a racing car, was available with a big V6 and a range of sporty looking options. But it was popular because Ford combined that pedigree with simple underpinnings, economical engines and genuine practicality. It was the perfect compromise. But in the motor industry, success can lead to complacency. The Capri was so popular that it became central to Ford's model range, and because it was a very normal car with a swoopy body, they attempted to milk it dry. In 1974, a Mark II Capri was launched with a new, wider body and the addition of a hatchback. From a practicality approach, that's a good thing, but the new body totally knackered the Capri's style. Fundamentally, it was still a good-looking swoopy coupe with the famous elliptic rear windows, but in practice, it had lost all the aggression of the original. Gone were the quad headlamps, gone were the little buttresses on the back, and gone were the vents on the side. The Capri's big selling point was gone, and things were only about to get worse. The old RS models had a halo effect on the whole Capri range, just as they did with the Escort. But for the Mark II, the RS was killed off. Instead, the Capri became available with luxury trim levels, and the Capri gear had no sporting intentions. It even came with a standard fit automatic transmission. In only a few years, the Capri had gone from being the pinnacle of cool to rather falling off a cliff. It was living on past glories, and cars like this and the Manta began to gather a rather seedy reputation all across Europe. Derek Trotter drove a Capri gear, and he kept the windows rolled up to make people think he had air conditioning. Rather than having a proper sports car, the Capri's accessibility and affordability made it a bit of a poser's car. In this sense, the Capri is an enigma. It's a car that became phenomenally popular phenomenally quickly, but it was its own victim, as some of the antisocial sorts began using it as an image enhancer. And with that came a level of undesirability and mistrust of the kind of person that bought a very cheap used Capri and drove it through an accessory shop with magnets strapped to the bodywork. But back to 1974, and it was obvious to everyone that the combination of the Mark II's wide-eyed, straight-laced appearance and a concentration of non-sporting trim levels had failed. It was still very successful, but its point of being different to the Escorts and Cortinas had gone, and sales were falling. By the mid-70s, it was just the less practical, more expensive option, and there was a revolution on the horizon. As always, the world is a much wider place than one car and its peers. Performance versions of both these coupes and normal family cars were nothing new, and just like the Capri, a base model Escort's image was made by the RS and Mexico, and in the mid-1970s, the hot hatch was rising to the stage. Enthusiasts were now fawning over Renault 5 Gordinis and Golf GTIs, and while a 3-litre Capri would leave them for dead in a straight line, the vinyl roof and chrome trim of the Ford was looking decidedly dated next to the deep bumpers and red trim of a GTI. The Blue Oval realised they had to change it up, but fundamentally, the Mark II's design was fine. It just needed tweaking to bring out the potential, and in 1978 they debuted the Mark III Capri. Ford weren't trying to fool anyone into thinking this was a new car, but in revising the Capri they restored most of the inherent sportiness and aggression that was lost back in '74. The bit that changed the most is the front end, and the bonnet's been extended over the headlamps to give it a hooded and moody kind of appearance. But probably just as importantly are the return of the quad circular headlamps, and together this takes a formerly surprised looking car and turns it into an aggressive and moody looking car. Bringing it up to date with the latest Ford trademarks were an Era-style grille, and at the back a set of ribbed rear lamps. But more importantly, all the chrome was gone, replaced with black wraparound bumpers, and to take away from the roundness and lack of edge to the rear end, an ever so period correct squishy spoiler was added. But alongside the Mark II Capri gear was the rather bland 3000S. So the simple solution was to give the Mark III Capri 3-litre S a big set of decals, just so you don't forget what it is. And by simply playing with the Capri's mood, Ford had brought the car directly in line with its most modern, more compact competitors. But at the same time, it was, in effect, the same car that had been launched back in '69, and Ford had always played the engineering game with a sense of caution. While other manufacturers were experimenting with front-wheel drive and modernising their suspension setups, Ford had stuck with what they knew best. The Capri was an amalgamation of Escort and Cortina philosophies, and both these cars had very simple underpinnings. Barring the McPherson struts at the front, their rear ends consisted of a live axle supported by leaf springs, which is exactly what the Capri was given. In the Cortina's case, the leaves were gone only a year later in 1970, and a decade later in 1980, the Escort was totally binned in favour of an independently sprung rear end in the new front-wheel drive Mark III Escort. This meant the Capri had to soldier on with what was, on paper, a totally agricultural suspension system. To bolster the car's sporting intentions, Ford's Skunk Works offered what was known as the X-Pack, upping the power of the Essex V6 from 140 to 175 brake horsepower, with the help of some Weber carburetors, larger valves and a new exhaust. And despite the age, period journalists couldn't find anything to complain about. In fact, anything that could match the 120 mph top speed was a lot more expensive. The Capri remained the people's supercar, and in 1981 received its final big hurrah. The intervening 3 years had seen Ford introduce the new hot Escort, the XR3, And with it came all that aesthetic we'd seen on the Golf GTI, populating the XR3 with driving lamps, decals, alloy wheels and a body kit. So Ford knew that to retain its share of the pie, the Capri needed one final leg up, and it was known as the 2.8 injection. The Essex V6 fitted to British Capris was gone, replaced with the cleaner German-built Cologne V6, and with it the buzzwords of the era, fuel injection. The Bosch Cagetronic system clawed 160 brake horsepower from its 2.8 litres and allowed the Capri to gallop to 60 in only 7.7 seconds, pushing the Capri even further clear of the modern performance pretenders, while underneath its age was addressed by Bilstein shock absorbers, stiffer springs, thicker anti-roll bars, wider wheels, vented disc brakes and a 5-speed gearbox. The hot hatches may have been more modern, but you don't get rear-wheel drive or a burbling, thumping V6 in an XR3i, and you certainly don't get this level of style. The Capri was always a great-looking car, but with pepper pot alloy wheels and the injection decals, these cars were almost effortlessly cool. It's so simple it looked as though it was barely trying. This blue paintwork sheens in the sunlight to subtly expose the hump in the bonnet and broadness in the shoulders. Plus, that rear window shape is iconic in its own right. The car we have with us today is actually an injection special, introduced in 1984 as a slight update of the formula, with RS-style wheels and two-tone paint, as well as a limited slip differential. But inside, there's a whole other dimension, because while the dashboard was a little dated, that view out over the bulge and the way it falls into the footwell gives it an air of sporting minimalism. And the half-leather Recaro seats are to die for, incredibly comfortable and massively supportive. But I say this from a very British perspective. Britain has always adored Fords, and the Capri was one of our favourites. It may have been old, but for many people it was an affordable and attainable window into the world of exotica. But as I mentioned before, they did attain a rather seedy image. It was so bad in Europe that the Opel Manta became the butt of jokes, and that extended to the Capri, as the 2.8 injection only survived a few years before it was killed off in Europe in 1984. By that point, only the Cologne factory in Germany was producing them, with every single car coming straight over to the UK. It's confusing to try and understand why the likes of an Escort XR3i became more desirable than a Capri injection. But as with so many sections of automotive history, once people get an image into their heads, it's hard to shift. But in addition to that, the Capri had simply run its course, and the final cars were produced in December 1986. The Ford Capri was a moment in history. It was a time when a mainstream manufacturer could take a very modest set of mechanical components, dress them up in a swoopy body and sell them in huge numbers. Taken in retrospect, it seems implausible in 2023 for such a phenomenon to happen, but it did. And the Capri has become a total icon in British motoring history. Its success was a totally isolated incident, but its existence, oh no. These things, despite a lull in their image, are one of the few cars that the automotive community really mourns the loss of. For some reason, the idea of a affordable and very normal car in a swoopy coupe body is something that British people cannot get away from. But it's already happened. While the Capri had this character arc from hero to naff to hero to naff, this love-in we seem to have with it is amazing. But as we've already mentioned, the Capri was by no means the only affordable sports car you could buy. And even after it was discontinued, Vauxhall launched the Calibra, Rover gave us the Tomcat, Volkswagen showed us the Corrado, and Ford came back with the Probe and Cougar, then the little Puma. But none of these cars had the faintest hint of success the old Capri did. This car is a novelty, it's a curiosity, And it's probably the most fascinating example of how marketing and perception can both make and break a car. There has always been a car on sale in Britain in this market segment. Maybe not as versatile and certainly not as popular, but they have existed. And here's the point. Back in 1969, the Ford Capri was launched to be the European Mustang. And with that in mind, there's no need for a direct, at least sporting, Capri replacement. Because since 2015, you've been able to walk into your local Ford dealer and buy, in right-hand drive, a Ford Mustang. This story is not yet over. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. As I mentioned, this car is to be auctioned by Bidding Classics, so if you fancy yourself a little 2.8 injection Capri, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.